Tak, dobrý večer. Já se tady...
Well, good evening. It's a great honor and pleasure for me to introduce Mr. Yang Lian, a Chinese poet. So,
in theory, you should.
Yes, sorry, I just forgot I should speak English. So, welcome everybody. I'm very pleased and honored to introduce to you Mr. Yang Lian, who is a Chinese poet living in Britain, in Great Britain. In the beginning, I will just summarize in a few words his biography, and then we will have a sort of a discussion in which we will learn more about him. Yang Lian was born in 1955, so he is a, generation of poets who grew up in the People's Republic of China. He spent his childhood in the capital, in Peking. Then he was sent to the countryside for re-education through labor in late 60s, early 70s. After he returned back to the city, to Peking, he joined the young people's movement for free speech and democracy, known as the Democracy Wall, in 1978, and he started to publish his poems in the well-known journal Jintian. He is a very unusual poet in all his generation. We will talk about it more in the discussion, I hope. Later, during 1980s, he was invited to go abroad, and actually since 1988, he has been living outside China. He published a lot of poems, translated into many languages, including some Czech translations in the past. He publishes also critical essays about essays about literature and also about other topics. And he is also active in the International Pen Club and in all sorts of projects dealing with Chinese literature and Chinese culture. So I think that's a brief introduction. That's enough. I will start my first question with a rather personal question. How was your childhood in Peking?
Well, I have to say, not only Peking, but China, it's becoming my own foreign country after I becoming New Zealand and the British citizens. So it's very weird, but as a pair of that sentence, I'm still writing the Chinese, which I call my foreign mother tongue. And but on the other side, a city where you're growing up, then it's a very important material and a force in, let's say, my imagination. And Peking, for me, it is now an imagination, because the Peking I remember, it's totally gone. When I went back to China, I can see only the name of the street, but the street I know it's already long gone and totally different. So it's my imagination. It will be part of my imagination, maybe deeper and deeper. So I think, yes, it's a fiction.
A Peking in your heart. Okay. You started writing poetry back in the countryside. Why did you start writing poetry? And how could you suddenly start writing poetry?
Well, for my generation and also for so-called contemporary Chinese poetry, cultural revolution is a very important word. And that the 10 years of nightmare, on one side, bring the whole country, let's say, whole culture into the bottom line, but on the other side, this nightmare also, is really a great education. Only when I been sent to the countryside, the village, let's say I learned what's mean of the real life and what's mean of the real China. and I meet those peasants who generationally work in the village, and I gradually approach that feeling, love and hate of land. They have to love it because that's the only way they can gain the food or something. But they hate it so much because it's like being locked there like a prisoner. And it's so complicated. But immediately touched something like to myself, and I started from there. I thought, okay, maybe this is something, my life actually like that. But I formally said my poetry have been started to writing at 1976 after my mother died. Well, he was actually younger than I am now. So it's that kind of suddenly the loneliness, the very strange feeling, which is like a small boat, but in the borderless ocean. And so the poetry, it's the only possible way, let me feel a little bit less lonely after when I sit at a small wooden table with a lamp and when others are sleeping and write something. Now I will not say it's a poetry, but it's something.
Did you read poetry? Did you read a lot of poetry before coming to the moment that you want to write it yourself?
Well, at the beginning, I have to say, I hate poetry. But when I was about 7 years old, my father, like all the Chinese parents, probably intellectual parents, and started to almost force me to read the great Tang Dynasty poet Du Fu and other poets, their works and read by heart. And after dinner, it's the poetry time, and this is really a nightmare. And I hate so much, but I have to say, now I thank so much to my father, because when I start to write my own poems, and suddenly all these musical rhythms, the forms, the energy of organizing of the language is coming back to judge my words. It's my, let's say, I am not allowed my words, let's say, to be weak. That's, I have to say, yes, I have been educated.
Do you still know some poems by heart? Some classical poems?
Well, less than I should be. I should do, but I do something. Yeah.
You do something?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you want
will you teach? No, perhaps, yes? Okay.
Really? And, okay, that's the 8th line of Du Fu, which is my favorite poem, and especially favorite poem on exile. I think my exile had been written perfectly by this poem in 1,240 years ago, about that. It's called Deng Gao, Climb a Terrace. And, well, I don't explain it, but lesson song. 风急天高猿啸哀，渚清沙泊鸟飞怀。无边落木萧萧下，不尽长江滚滚来。万里悲秋常作客，百年多病独登台。艰难苦恨繁霜鬓，潦倒新停浊酒杯。
Thank you. Wonderful.
Thanks, Du Fu, not me.
Well, a melancholy autumn poem of a lonely man.
If you allow me just to say one, I can tell you how exquisite. That there was a one line, 无边落木萧萧下, the borderless dry leaves. And 萧萧 is a song of the dry leaves. And finally, 下 means falling. But listening the tone of 下 came down. Then you can actually listening how the music painted picture in your ear. And that's one example.
Okay, thank you, thank you. Well, let's say a few words about your poetry. I remember reading your poem for the first time. It's nearly, 20 years ago. By coincidence, I came across a poem by Lian, and I was really impressed because his poem was quite different from majority of poems that were written at that time. And the main difference or the most striking features were, first, the poem was very long and very complicated as far as its structure is concerned, unlike majority of these short and very tight and direct poems. And then it was penetrated with a very special feeling towards the past and towards something which is, let's say, pre-cultural, very deep in human soul, which goes beyond any culture and any sophistication, I would say. It was, in a sense, a wild poem. So I wonder, how was it that you started to write so differently? And do you find it substantial, these qualities that I just mentioned for your poetry?
I think one of the most dangerous things for poets and the poetry in the world is we actually use the so-called subject or subject matter to cover the real matter or question of poetry. I actually, in a simple way, I would like to say, to have a painful life experience, it's not necessary to create a good literature, especially poetry. So I think poetry is based on the great creative form. And the poem you mentioned that it was No Lang, and it was written in 1983. By then, that was maybe the first poem among those poets' friends, which is the first time to build up something so-called sequence. The sequence, it means have a very deliberately designed structure. And in the structure, different subjects, like in the symphony, the music, different subjects start, develop, meeting and separate, and then finally end up in another level. And actually, that's something I have to say. This form coming back to me quite often, especially when I feel my life experience and my idea about literature reached a certain moment which I can sum up something. For example, when I left China, first about 2 years, I wrote only in very short and sharp forms, which is because I just want to catch my life by those very short forms. But until this exiled feeling, the everyday is like an ending, but the ending itself is endless. Only then when that kind of a philosophical understanding had been built, I come back to the sequence and wrote this Where the Sea Stands Still. And that through this 12 parts sequence, finally reached the last line. This is the show where we see ourselves set sail. All external journeys actually are internal journeys. So that is what the necessity between the forms and the poetic.
Yeah, actually, for those who didn't read your poetry, Yang Lian is a very complicated poet, a poet that, that he confessed to me during the break, really spends a lot of time on writing and on rewriting and composing his poetry. It's very interesting because it's not so usual among contemporary Chinese poets. I wonder, because you are also a poet who is quite outspoken on political issues, and you are active in the International Pen. How does it fit together with your, let's say, political engagement?
Well, politically and poetically, this is the two wonderful things, actually never against each other, but one in the deeper than the other. To me, poetically, it's deeper. Poetically, it's deeply based on or rooted inside of yourself. And by the understanding of poetry, you can go back to all, in Chinese, the Qu-Yuan, the Du-Fu, from 2,300 years ago, or to the Western poets, all the way back to Dante, Homer, since you understand the poetry, you understand individuality, you understand the individual creative power and the energy to against the thing to try to limit you. Therefore, a good poet must be a good a person who has clear political standard and principle. So it's, I think if you say I'm a good poet or he is a good poet, it's already naturally hold the attitude in the reality. And again, as a Chinese poet, I have to always mention that this nearly 3,000 Chinese poetry tradition is always behind of me. And I have to say, any good poetry, there's no meaning of past. If you moved by the poem, it is now. So I have to think my works worth for those great ghosts, which is just now, sit here. And otherwise, if I only try to be a journalist or political figure or go to streets, as a poet, this sometimes important, but it's not the real point.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and in fact, you have been living in Europe for many years by now. Do you relate your poetry to Europe, or do you relate it to China?
I have to say, well, we always use nowadays a popular word, the other. So easily imagine the European or the Western culture is the other for Chinese. But I have to say that classical Chinese literature tradition is another the other for us. And there's no one today actually naturally or dare can say, I am a classical Chinese. Because the language, the life, even the communism, there was nothing to do, or actually maybe catch the, I'm sorry, but the bad side of the Chinese tradition. So I think contemporary Chinese poetry, if we say it, is very individual. It's like something built up on two cliffs. That side, classical Chinese. The other side, maybe European cultural tradition. But in the good way, we could say we actually have, we are a great link, we are creative. But in the other way, probably we could say we are broken, we are shallow, But it's all the inspirations, all actually, everything start our thinking. We read so much the Western literature in translation. And if they are good good friend of Du Fu or Qu-Yuan. And so it's, it's all the resource help me.
Is there any substantial, radical discovery for you after coming to Europe for your poetic writing?
Well, the Europe, and especially stay in London, that was my own choice. After I traveling around the world many, many times, south, north, and east, west. But, well, I like the place where it has a long history, because that it provides some different way of thinking and the way to look at things. And then there was not so much choice. I speak a little bit this kind of a Younglish, That's why I think I can try London. But then I think that's good idea, which is in the sense not see things only from a black or white, trying to use our poetry to do political propagandas again. But poetry build up the inner complexity and our even contradictions inside ourselves and questioning ourselves layers by layers. And so in that case, yes, I think I really enjoyed to share my mind with the same people, but maybe in different cultures.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I'm afraid our time is over. I feel a little bit uneasy here because I don't see the audience. So I don't know whether they are happy or unhappy about our conversation. But now I think I will...
Thank you very much. We're already used to know this situation. Yeah.
I will give the word to you to read your poems.
Okay.
And then there will be Czech translations read aloud, as far as I understand.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. Since we just talked about the form and structure, so this is a quite special selection for you. It's a small group of poems with 4 pieces. And yesterday I already talked about this. The title of the poem is called Dark Nieces. It was written in the middle of 90s when I was in exile in New York. Well, the road to go back to China seems becoming really quite hopeless. But the journey in the West is endless. So I was really thinking how the English word of darkness has no plural when we feel so many darkness are around us and inside of us. And when by then my room was just directly by Hudson River. When this river floating away every day, hanging there like a background of my life, and I decided to write a small group of poems and titled Dark Nieces in Chinese. And my translator, I told him, you have to translate it into Dark Nieces. And so that's, let's say, with my very, very poor English, I add a new word into English. Okay. Here we will read piece by piece. So you can follow that structure. During the reading, you don't need to have any expression, but make your expression after the whole thing. 黑暗们1绿叶总是被遗忘在窗口太绿了的时候，像春天用力掷出的每一粒石子都击中春天自己。鸟儿仍穿着蓝色的旱冰鞋，老狗的眼睛却厌倦了。河岸的拍打声用不着翻译，死亡的美学唆使花朵们蜂拥而出。唯一忍住狂暴内心的，只有田野。逃得更远时，4月嗅出了血液。阳光中，树林守在我们身后。那不能带走的知识，又把死者带走。朗诵一首诗。被加深的寂静，另一个世界还是这个世界。黑暗说
Tehdy se na zelené listy zapomíná.
Green leaves always forgotten when windows are too green. Like every pebble roughly thrown by spring hitting spring itself. Birds still wearing arid skates of blue. Though old dog eyes are tired out. No need to translate the riverbanks slapping. The aesthetics of death inside the swarming of the flowers. Fields alone can tolerate the furious heart. Fleeing still further. April sniffs out blood. In sunlight, the wood crouches behind us. Knowledge that can't be taken away. It takes away the dead. Reciting a poem, a deepened stillness, the other world is still this world, darkness would say.
2. 没有故事的人，用逃出日子的姿势，逃进一个日子。没有过去的人，过去了。海鸥被暮色制成一本抽象的书，锁在隔离病房里。谁不是疯子？妄想比肉体更像片段，玻璃的片段。骨骼碎裂声响在外围，舌根腐烂的片段，黄昏为流失而流失。老鼠们叫着，光踩疼自己时的尖叫，每天被每天吓醒了。同一个黑夜，没有人的故事，没有人的故事，再讲一次仍不会发生。黑暗说。
A storyless person escapes into a day with a gesture of escaping from the day. A pastless person has passed away. Seagulls worked into an abstract book by the evening. Locked in the isolation ward. Who isn't crazy? Delusions? More like fragments than flesh? Fragments of glass, shattering skeleton heard on the periphery, fragments of rotting tongue. Twilight washes away, just washes away. Rats squeal, shrill squeals as light stamps on itself, each day startled awake by each day. With one black night, a personless story, still won't come true told twice, darkness would say.
3. 每一场雨都使你坐在自己的终点上，雨声敲打屋顶，小动物的脚步把你静止地移入黑暗。在静止的天气里，你需要别人睡去，睡眠就是离开，雨季的整个世界离开，黑暗才穿过你，像一匹烈马穿过火焰。在你里面听，四周银白的针脚缝补一件肉质的破旧风衣。每一场雨只落进这片空地，你从终点读起时，一页黑色的说明，不疲倦地为下个白昼更换一个人，篡改一个住址，墓地的街更泥泞，挑剔一只手。乞丐们彼此仇恨的拥挤，组成无处躲雨的城市。大群湿漉漉的乌鸦在你里面冲撞，繁殖长着共同面孔的不同罪恶。黑暗说。
Each shower of rain makes you sit at your end. Rain rapping on the roof. Tiny animal steps move you motionlessly into the darkness. In motionless weather, you need others to sleep. To sleep is to leave. The world of the rainy season leaves. Once darkness has passed through you like a thoroughbred through the fire. Here inside you, silvery white stitches everywhere, stitching a worn-out wind cheater of flesh. Every shower falls only on this bare ground. When you begin reading from your end, a page of black explanation unweariedly swaps someone else for next day, forges an address, the graveyard street still muddier, finds fault with his hand, beggars huddled together in mutual hatred, making a city with nowhere to shelter from the rain. A flock of soaking crows collides inside you, breeds different crimes with identical faces. Darkness would say.
4. 但黑暗什么也没说。黑暗与黑暗之间，仅仅是这个春天。风筝的骨头挂在树梢上，树皮发亮，接吻的情人走过树下，花粉在肺里敲着去年的锣。一个鲜红的小丑，总能让孩子狂奔。嚼着小手的牙越来越绿，旧报纸的草坪交给火焰的剪子。4月就以河流为幻影，河流那忘却的颜色以我们为幻影。歌哨烧焦后，所有星星被孩子玩够了，塞进一座漆黑的闸门。黑暗中总有一具躯体飘回不做梦的地点。连我们怕，也只怕自己的恐惧。黑暗什么也不说，街头每一个行人就开始喃喃自语。黑暗在聆听嘴唇上涂抹的猩红色黑暗。一座春天的学校永远让我们无知，一个记忆，谁活在其中，谁就是鬼魂。而疾病使表情变薄，镜子戴在脸上时，大海消化一尾死鱼，被呕吐着，仍喋喋不休。黑暗太多了，以致生命从未抵达它一次。春天走出我们，春天才终于沉默。
But darkness didn't say a thing between dark and dark. Only this spring, kites' bones hang in the treetops, bark shines, lovers pass kissing under the tree, pollen in the lungs beating last year's gong. A bright red clown always makes children run wild. Greener and greener the teeth that chew little hands, old newspaper lawn, hands over scissors of flame. So April sees the river flow like a mirage. The current's forgotten colors see us as mirages. Once the dove's call is burnt black, all the stars are broken toys stuffed in a pitch-black floodgate. In darkness, there is always a body drifting back to the place of no dreaming. Even we fear, only fear our own terror. Darkness doesn't say a thing. Every walker on the street starts muttering to himself. Darkness is listening to the orange-red darkness of lipstick. A spring school always makes us ignorant. Memory, who lives in it as a ghost, but sickness attenuates the look when a mirror's worn on the face. The ocean digests a dead fish. Being vomited is still endless chatter. Darknesses are too many for life ever to have got there. Spring walks out of us. Only then is spring silent at last. Translated from the Chinese by Brian Holton.
就完了吧。